Thank you very much for that introduction, Georgina, and thank you very much for that welcome. I pay tribute to the traditional owners, Lieutenant Governor, other distinguished guests, and I think that's just about everyone, as has already been said. Australia has changed enormously through its brief history of little more than 100 years. Some parts of the Act of Federation itself would be strongly criticised in today's world. Aboriginals in South Australia had had the vote and were counted as people. The creation of Australia and the Constitution endorsed by the states and the British Parliament robbed them of that right. Few Australians would be aware that 18 years later, when the League of Nations was being negotiated, Prime Minister Billy Hughes was active in opposing the Japanese proposal to place a racial equality clause in the preamble to the League. The record seems to show that Britain and much of Europe would have accepted such a clause, and Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, when the Australian Prime Minister and other racists marshalled significant opposition. I've seen the words proposed by Japan. They were reasonable. The words were, "The equality of nations being a basic principle of the League of Nations, the high contracting parties agree that concerning the treatment and rights to be accorded to aliens in their territories, they will not discriminate, either in law or in fact, against any person or persons on account of his or her race or nationality." It's also an interesting byproduct of history that in 1860, the United Kingdom had a racial equality treaty with the Chinese Empire, and both empires agreed to give full racial equality with no discrimination to all peoples within their empires. It was the Australian states, more than almost anyone else, who helped to destroy that British treaty. A meeting was called to try and reach an agreement, a compromise agreement, over the Japanese proposal. Prime Minister Billy Hughes made it clear that he had no intention of attending such a meeting. To him, it was not the words that were at fault, but the underlying idea that was so repugnant and so offensive. At the foundation of Australia, the White Australia policy was opposed by the British government, but supported by all political forces within Australia. The policy at that time had particular relevance for Chinese, many of whom had been here since the days of the gold rushes, for Afghanis, many of whom have helped to open up the dry parts of Australia, and for Kanakas who had been brought here as in indentured labour to work in the sugar industry in Queensland. White Australia remained Australia's policy for too many years after the Second World War. Sir Thomas White, at the time Minister for Trade and Customs in the Australian government, in 1938 attended a meeting in Evian, France. 31 countries were present. The purpose of the meeting was to try and work out some solution for the very large numbers of Jews then fleeing Nazi Germany. During the course of discussion at the conference, Sir Thomas White said that, "Under the circumstances, Australia cannot do more, for it will be appreciated that in a young country, manpower from the source from which most of its citizens have come is preferred, while undue privileges cannot be given to one particular class of non-British subject without injustice to others. It will no doubt be appreciated also that as we have no real racial problems in Australia, we are not desirous of importing one by encouraging any scheme of large-scale foreign immigration." 1938. There were many Australians, of course, deeply ashamed of such views, but those words all too frequently represented the Australia, and as the world knew Australia in the days before the Second World War. After the war, political leaders around the world knew that civilization as we had understood it had so nearly been destroyed. Victors and vanquished knew that they had to do better or the world would not survive. Two of the world's most destructive wars had occurred within less than a quarter of a century. Countless millions had died and perished directly in that war or as a consequence of it. Australians knew that Australia had to change and change dramatically. We had so nearly been invaded. The battles of the Coral Sea and the Midway could have gone either way. It was Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor which really brought America into the war and thus saved Australia from invasion. It's worth noting that after Pearl Harbor, the United States initially declared war on Japan alone and not on Nazi Germany. The war had been a wake-up call for Australia. After the war, the Labour Party and the Liberal Party both accepted that we had to undertake a major task of nation building. We had to invest in the future of this country as never before. We needed people, more people, to develop, to build, to expand Australia, to undertake a major task of nation building, and in so doing, make Australia defensible. Arthur Calwell persuaded the Australian Council of Trade Unions to accept a major migration program, a remarkable achievement, 600,000 servicemen and women waiting to be demobilised, the memories of 25–30% unemployment through the Depression, only 7 years away. He hoped that 9 out of every 10 new citizens would come from the United Kingdom and Ireland. That hope was never fulfilled. He was a firm supporter of the White Australia policy, as was Menzies as leader of the opposition. Thus, within the compass of White Australia, firmly supported by political leaders, Australia embarked on a major migration program. The political parties at the time probably did not realise that it was a great awakening for this country. It was a creative period for the world. The United Nations was established. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was endorsed in 1948. Treaties and protocols were negotiated to give legal force to its high principles. The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund were established. The first to assist the development of the Third World, the second to try and establish stability in financial markets, especially between developed countries, and to avoid any recurrence of the Depression of the 1930s. It was an optimistic time. Despite the onset of the Cold War, there was a sense of enthusiasm and of idealism abroad. The first significant step in the destruction of the White Australia policy was probably a speech by Hubert Opperman as Minister for Immigration, setting out a new policy in 1966. Up to that point, there were a number of incremental steps. One of the more important ones was the ratification of the Refugee Convention in 1954 by the Menzies government, a ratification that took place with little fanfare and virtually no publicity, but which, as the sixth ratification, brought the convention into force. Legal remnants were abolished by the Whitlam government in 1972. The first major test of the new policy of the open, non-discriminatory Australia came in the late 1970s, when tens of thousands of refugees came to Australia from Indochina. The citation for the 2009 Sir Edward Weary Dunlop Asia Link Medal, given to Professor Nancy Viviani, put it this way: the immigration stakes in the 70s and 80s were much higher than today. The Fraser government, in response to the humanitarian disaster in Vietnam, allowed refugees on a scale and at a speed not seen before or since. More than 100,000 Indo-Chinese immigrated in that period. Professor Viviani said that the role of government at the time for Australians' Vietnamese refugee entry was the first real test of the disestablishment of the White Australia policy, and a test successfully passed. I've met people who either came or whose parents came during that time, and said that when they were billeted in Adelaide, for example, they found there were clothes or toys for their children waiting. There was no razor wire. There were no detention centres or jails for newly arrived migrants, for refugees. We did not need them. These great changes in Australia had taken place harmoniously and productively. Australia could not have developed as she has without the work, the ethic, the ingenuity of Australians who have come here in the post-war years to make a new home and to adopt a new country. The changes perhaps emphasised quite starkly from my own state. I know here you have a Lieutenant Governor from Vietnam, but the present Governor in Victoria, Alex Chernoff, from Lithuania in 1949. The previous Governor, David de Kretser, from British Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, in 1948. Such a thing could not have happened in the Australia before the World War, the Second World War. We were starting to come of age. We were starting, I had believed, to develop a sense of independence, a sense of self. At the inauguration of the Institute of Multicultural Affairs on the 30th of November 1981, I made a speech which indicated that multiculturalism was now an accepted reality. I thought the battle against racial or religious discrimination in Australia had been won. I had regarded those changes in Australia as secure and unshakable. Events in more recent times have shown that that was perhaps an optimistic conclusion. As I said at the time, one critical process has been the way Australia's ethnic communities have developed, the initiatives they have taken, and the responses they've evoked. Migrants established churches, community groups, welfare associations, schools and sporting clubs through which they could preserve and develop those aspects of the inheritance they valued. They established ethnic communities, but did not cut themselves off from the community at large. They asserted their right to be accorded a place of respect within the Australian community, within its established constitutional framework, a place that acknowledged their linguistic and cultural needs and rights. Patiently and doggedly, ethnic communities sought out and changed the attitude of the press, educators, welfare agencies, churches, politicians, public servants, and the general public. They secured acceptance of the issues which concerned them as legitimate and significant items on the nation's social and political agendas. And a little later in the same speech, the key elements of multiculturalism can be simply stated. They are based both on realism and idealism. The starting point is the recognition and appreciation of the fact that the Australian population is derived from a wide variety of ethnic and cultural backgrounds, and that these backgrounds are important to the way Australians see themselves. The sheer duration and magnitude of immigration into this country, the plain facts of the composition of Australia's population, mean that even if we wished otherwise, ethnic and cultural diversity can neither be ignored nor readily extinguished. We know that the attempt to enforce conformity holds high costs, both for the individual and for society. It denies people their identity and self-esteem. It drives a wedge between children and their parents. Ultimately, it poses a real threat of alienation and division. We cannot demand of people that they renounce the heritage they value and yet expect them to feel welcome as full members of our society. Realism alone dictates that cultural differences must be responded to in a positive way. But multiculturalism is concerned with far more than passive toleration of diversity. It sees diversity as a quality to be actively embraced, a source of social wealth and dynamism. It encourages groups to be open and to interact so that all Australians may learn and benefit from each other's heritages. Multiculturalism is about diversity, not division. It is about interaction, not isolation. It is about cultural and ethnic differences set within a framework of shared fundamental values which enables them to coexist in a complementary rather than a competitive basis. It involves respect for the law and for our democratic processes and institutions. Insisting on a core area of common values is no threat to multiculturalism, but indeed its guarantee, for it provides the minimal conditions in which the well-being of all is secured. Not least, multiculturalism is about equality of opportunity of the members of all groups to participate in and benefit from Australia's social, economic and political life. This concern with equality of opportunity is dictated both by morality and hard-nosed realism. What I noted in that speech was possible because of the basic humanity of the overwhelming majority of Australians and because politicians of major parties refuse to play politics with race or religion. The post-war Australia had done so much, achieved so much, overcome so many differences, and indeed diminished differences between people who in their own countries had been rivals or perhaps enemies. Such an achievement was a considerable one. It also provided the opportunity for the quality of political debate to be enhanced so that our leaders could talk about serious matters concerning the future of Australia, where we should be as we move through this century to the next. Tragically, events started to change when Immigration Minister Jerry Hand established fixed and closed detention centres for boat people for asylum seekers. Then along came Pauline Hanson. Neither the government nor the opposition condemned her as she should have been condemned. The toughest words went something like, "I don't agree with her, but she has a right to say it." And that's code for saying that there's a considerable argument on her side. The words chosen, I believe, were deliberately chosen. The right to free speech, which we all possess, does not involve a right to create racial tension and division. The proper exercise of free speech requires common sense and good judgment, human decency and rejection of statements that will create divisions between peoples. In the 1990s, those necessary restraints on our right to free speech were forgotten. It is so easy for political leaders, who are sometimes presumed to know more than they do, or are presumed to have a higher motivation than they do, to arouse fears of the unknown of people who come from a different background, a different history, a different culture, and a different religion. In 2001, the then government was facing defeat. Heavily armed troops were placed on a boat that had rescued over 200 asylum seekers at sea, responding to the law of the sea. Under the normal law of the sea, that boat should have been allowed to go to the nearest port of call. The Tampa was prevented from approaching Australia. That incident resonated around the world even before 9/11 ushered a new era of distrust and fear. Political leaders then told us that boat people were illegal, queue jumpers, they'd push drugs, they'd be evil, they'd be prostitutes and maybe terrorists. The circumstances from which they were fleeing were forgotten, and there was a deliberate attempt to create fear of people coming here at the time, largely from the Middle East or South Asia. Politically, the tactic worked. The Liberal Party followed its leader and the opposition was divided. There were those who believed in an open and multicultural society, as I did and do. But there were also those who really supported what the government was doing. But whatever the balance in the Labor Party at the time, the party decided that the Liberals had ripped enough redneck votes out of the Labor Party and they weren't going to let them rip any more. Now, that's not an assumption from looking at the outside. Those words were used in a conversation I had with one of Labour's most senior people at the time. Political leaders used arguments against asylum seekers which were mean, petty, and false. How can you join a queue when there is no queue? How can you apply to come to Australia when there's no Australian office to which you can apply? If members of your family have been imprisoned or murdered by some dictator, how can you go to that dictator and say, please give me a passport so I may leave legally and seek safety? In January of this year, the Federal Parliamentary Library research team put together a paper setting out the facts about asylum seekers and refugees. The paper demonstrates clearly that the words used to describe boat people are mostly inaccurate and in some cases, most cases, downright false. In the first draft I used different words. I thought downright false was slightly politer. The terms illegal, queue jumpers are falsely and emotively used. Claims that they get higher welfare benefits than Australians are false. That Australia is being swamped by boat arrivals are false. What we are being swamped with, asylum claims are false. That boat arrivals bring disease are false. That most asylum seekers arrive by boats are false. It's a factual document, well worth reading, well worth much more publicity than it's achieved. And when it so directly contradicts the claims that have been made by many politicians over the years, why haven't the press recorded it? Most asylum seekers come by air and with papers. They get here on a student or visitor's visa and then they claim asylum. Historically, boat arrivals make up only a small proportion of asylum applicants. For many years, over 90% of asylum seekers came by air. There is no debate about them. They are not put in immigration detention centres while waiting for their applications to be processed. The first thing Australians need to try and do, and governments ought to do, is to make a concerted and bipartisan effort to get the facts out into the Australian marketplace. If governments won't do it, then we must do what we can. Only a short while ago, I visited the Asylum Seekers Resource Centre in Melbourne. They're providing food, medical and legal assistance, practical assistance, English language training to asylum seekers who come here by air and who have nothing. It also provided me with a practical lesson in the consequences of inhumane policies pursued by recent Australian governments. Many of these asylum seekers are not entitled to work, to unemployment benefits, to Centrelink, to any health or welfare benefits. They're not entitled to any English language training. They're not entitled to anything. They're in no man's land. This particular resource centre assists over 1,000 such people on a very regular basis. They have over 700 volunteers, including doctors, lawyers, all sorts of people. Governments have deliberately placed them in no man's land in the hope that the barbaric treatment will persuade them to go home. Large numbers from this resource centre, manned overwhelmingly by volunteers, have, after legal advice has been provided, been proven to be genuine refugees. It is not often that governments deliberately set out to try to create extreme poverty and hardship in our midst, but this is precisely the consequence of current policies in relation to asylum seekers. This centre operates 10 minutes from the central business district of Melbourne. The Refugee Convention, as far back as 1954, recognised that refugees often travel without official documents, without papers. It was in the nature of being a refugee. They often travelled by unconventional means. It was often the only way they could travel. The boat people who have travelled here without papers couldn't come here by air because to get on an aeroplane, you need official papers. I was speaking to a young man making a significant contribution to Australia some weeks ago, whose parents came from a former Soviet Union. They had to pay in Italy. whether it was for a fare or a bribe, whatever, before they could get on a boat to Australia. So many people who came here in the late 40s, 50s, 60s and 70s would have paid somebody, some organisation, for some part of their journey here. I am no admirer of people who call themselves people smugglers, but if somebody is fleeing terror and wants to escape to save their lives, to save their family, to prevent their children being persecuted, if they cannot get papers, if they cannot get official transport by ship or by air, what are they going to do? They'll try and find somebody who will, for a fee, take them somewhere where there may be a future. It's important to understand why people get on boats. There's a false impression, I think, that people smugglers canvass around saying, we have a boat, it's going to Australia, buy a ticket, you can claim asylum, as though people smugglers canvass for asylum seekers to fill their boats. The fact demonstrates otherwise. The fact that overwhelmingly people who come by boat are genuine refugees and are proven to be so by judgments made by Australian authorities or by UNHCR, demonstrates that there are people fleeing terror, fleeing a tyrannical government, political persecution and oppression. Such people will be actively looking for a means to escape from their own country. Changing circumstances in countries of the Middle East and South Asia do cause the numbers of asylum seekers to rise or to fall. Any impact of the boat people themselves or policies in Australia and Europe demonstrably have minimum influence. What has been said on this issue represents one more falsehood in the record of this demeaning debate. If Australians had been told of the circumstances of Afghan families persecuted and denied rights under the Taliban, I'm sure Australians would have welcomed such people as warmly as refugees were welcomed from Indochina. If you had a couple of girls in your family under the Taliban, Afghanistan, what options did you have? The girls could not be educated. If you tried and were found out, they and you, as parents, would probably have been shot. And that was the penalty for illegally educating girls. You would do everything you could to get some place where your girls would have a future. What would you do? Stay or leave? People who've taken such actions have been condemned by political leaders in Australia. To its credit, the current government made some beneficial changes to policy when they first came into government. Well, I suppose it was the government before the current government. It was Mr. Rudd's government. They had learned how to frighten Australians, and they weren't going to give it up. The government was charged with having lost control of our borders. The Liberal Party had learned how to win votes on this issue. They had learned how to frighten Australians, and they weren't going to give it up. The government was charged with having lost control of our borders. The government was turning Australia into a soft touch. The Liberal Party totally ignored the fact that it was the circumstances in the countries from which people flee that led to people seeking refuge on boats to Europe or Australia. Now, because the Liberal Party has pursued the Labor government so vigorously on this issue, the government appears to have forgotten the common humanity which we should all share, and its rhetoric and its policies now argue that the government is just as tough as the opposition. Does Labor realise it can never outdo the coalition on inhumanity to asylum seekers? It should be noted that the Labor actually won the 2007 election, promising to be more humane to asylum seekers and to refugees. This is a demeaning debate. It's a miserable one. It also shows that the politicians who participated in this debate have contempt for all of us, for the majority of the Australian people. They believe, despite all the evidence to the contrary, that if they appeal to the fearful and mean sides of our nature, they will win support. They are showing that they believe we won't know enough about the world to know that, for the most part, what they're saying is plainly false. After Tampa, I was at a function in Harvard which I'd helped organise. Australian students at the Kennedy School asked if they could have a private meeting with me. They said it won't take long, we just had a couple of questions. They wanted to know how long they were going to have to pretend they were not Australian. I've had people in Finland, people from Latvia, from Cyprus speak to me and criticise me about these policies. I've had people from China raise these issues with me. As a consequence of Tampa, Australian policies have resonated around the world. They've done Australia no good at all. People are starting to ask, has Australia really changed from the Australia of old? In many ways, it's political leaders who give these impressions that are so out of touch, so divorced from the reality of the modern Australia. They never seem to realise that we are already a multicultural society. Too many people have come here from too many different places. We are a multicultural society, and nothing any politician does can alter that. It's just that some of them don't want to recognise it. Politicians can contribute greatly to the cohesiveness, the added strength that comes from diversity. Or if they want to, as too many have in recent years, they can hinder it. The nature of the political debate over immigration and asylum seekers has done more than anything in 100 years to diminish politicians in public estimation. These debates have also done Australia significant harm to our overseas reputation. In a moment, I'd like to make some recommendations about future policy. But before doing so, I'd like to say something about the most recent discussions with Malaysia over a people swap. We should not seek to avoid our obligations accepted originally by Menzies in 1954 by shifting asylum seekers to another country. There are many questions and many problems relating to the so-called agreement with Malaysia. The whole idea of swapping asylum seekers, including children, in this way, as if they are commodities, is odious. It is trading in people and bears no relationship whatsoever to the cooperation that was achieved during the exodus from Indochina. It does not represent an appropriate or a just solution. Against this background, what should we now do as Australia? Our approach to asylum seekers and refugees should be multifaceted. One, part of our approach should indeed be truly international. We should work through the United Nations much more vigorously to do much more to assist those countries in grievous trouble. We should try new and better ways of helping them resolve internal difficulties. It is only when such countries are living in peace and have put aside internal conflict and civil war that the flow of refugees will cease. We should also make sure that Western policy which we support, as we did in Iraq, as we are in Afghanistan, does not compound the problem and add greatly to the number of refugees and asylum seekers, as indeed those two conflicts have. While trying to marshal a greater international effort in the countries from which people flee, we should at the same time persuade those countries that accept refugees under UNHCR auspices, including ourselves, of course, to greatly lift the number they're prepared to take each year. For our part, we need a solution also that involves countries of our own region, but also countries who accept migrants and refugees in significant numbers, such as Canada and the United States. We need a truly international solution to the problems of our own region. I'm not aware that any such broad approach is or has been made. Mandatory immigration detention centres should be abolished. Detention for the purposes of health, identity, security checks alone should be permissible. We should be prepared to meet our obligations originally accepted by Menzies in 1954 and accept onshore processing. We should not be frightened of the consequences. There needs also to be an independent judicial examination of adverse reports by ASIO concerning would-be immigrants to Australia. The nature of the decision and the grounds of the decision should be available to the review. The review should report to Parliament, and ASIO should have no capacity to censor any part of that review. You may be surprised to know that there is a parliamentary committee that oversights our intelligence services. The intelligence services have a capacity with a compliant Attorney General to censor what the Oversight Committee reports in public. That is an absolute disgrace. That sort of the CIA, the National Security Agency do not have that power in the United States. In the United States, the Senate Oversight Committee reports what it wants to report, and the President himself cannot stop it or prevent it. The secrecy surrounding these matters, the inability of people to learn why they've been denied access or residence in Australia is shameful. We should be especially concerned about children in detention. The last but one government made a commitment to get children out of detention. In February, there were over 1,000 children in detention, and I'm advised that that was a record high, but the government is working on changing this. They need to work faster and harder. The High Court decision that a failed asylum seeker can be kept in jail for the term of his natural life if he cannot be returned to his country of origin for whatever reason should be overturned by statute. The punitive approach adopted to asylum seekers who seek to come to Australia by boat, who are detained often for years, and to asylum seekers who come to Australia by air, who are living in the community but are denied any kind of government support, should be replaced by a humane and compassionate policy where support is given to those in distress. I believe Australians will accept this approach if they knew the consequences and the hardship caused by current government policy. Australia should not involve itself in trading in people, in swapping asylum seekers whose status has not been proven for refugees waiting in some third country. We need to recapture our humanity, our bipartisanship. We won't achieve that until the political parties embrace a practical, humane and compassionate approach to this particular problem. The change will need to come from people making it clear that they want a change of attitude and a change of purpose from political parties, from those who hold office, especially in Canberra. We also need an independent report, a new Galbraith report, if you like, because times have changed so much, into post-arrival services and to the responsibility of governments, of community organisations for migrants and asylum seekers. Such a report would, on the historical evidence, be a useful guide to future policy, but would also help to expose some of the unhappy myths that have grown up around these issues. As our numbers increase, our capacity to influence our own region and indeed the wider world will grow. With the contributions Australians are capable of making, we can play a constructive role in the world. It is an unhappy fact that Australia has been at war in different parts of the world for far too many years since the Second World War. While some conflicts were concurrent, have overlapped, separate conflicts have endured for more than 41 years. For a country in a world that yearns for peace, it's a tragic record. We all need to contribute much more to establishing a more peaceful world. A strong multicultural Australia that draws strength from its diversity, that debates real issues of importance to ourselves and to common humanity, has contributed so much in the past. It must do so again. The pettiness and meanness of the current debates about asylum seekers, and indeed on other issues that are dealt with on a totally partisan basis, must be put aside. There's a special obligation on our political leaders to lift themselves off the bottom and take the debate in a different direction, based on fact, not hyperbole, based on humanitarian rather than punitive considerations, to rejoin the bipartisanship that will be needed to make meaningful contributions to such complex global challenges. We should also ask ourselves what we as Australians need to do so the politicians will learn to appeal to the best of our natures and cease playing politics with the lives of the most vulnerable people in the world. I believe there's a special obligation for Australians who've come or whose parents have come here in the post-war years to work for and maintain that Australia, because that is the Australia they came to. That is the Australia that has received them so warmly, and that is the Australia to which they've already contributed so much in so many different ways. We all need to work to return to that Australia, and that is what I would like to ask all of you to work for. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Mr. Fraser. What a wonderful and stirring oration. You have educated us, you've informed us, and also made very real the challenges we've...
There's an element in it, but it's not been really an element, I think, in Iraq, in the Middle East, Afghanistan, South Asia. Your question would certainly be extraordinarily relevant to African immigration across the Mediterranean to Europe. But most African migration that has come to Australia has been from war-torn, civil war circumstances, not so much as economic circumstances. People have been fleeing political terror. That's been the main cause.
Yes, the gentleman with his hand up there. If you can speak nice and loudly, we'll probably be able to hear you.
Mr. Fraser commented on the two major parties and correctly said that their refugee policies have been deficient. There is a third force in Australian politics, the Greens. I wonder if you'd like to comment on their policies, please.
Well, I suppose we'll get a better test of that from July onwards, won't we? I mean, how much pressure are they prepared to put on the government or on the next government when they have the balance of power in the Senate? And then we'll know really what they're prepared to fight for. At the moment, I'm not sure.
Do we have one last one? Right up the back, if you can speak nice and loudly and keep it just brief because we only have a couple of minutes.
I was wondering if you thought that the mishandling of the refugee issue is symptomatic of Australian politics today.
Well, it certainly led to it, but its cause was a government that was going to be defeated, looking for an issue which would enable it to win. And that's what led to what happened at Tampa and all the business of threats to our borders, threats to our integrity, threats to our values. And if you take a large number of years, the numbers of boat people would have been between 1,000 or 2,000 a year. Some years they've been higher, but some years they've been much lower. And nobody can say that's a number that's a threat to Australia. If they're not proven to be genuine refugees, they don't stay here anyway. So it was the way politics were played then, And one of the great distinguishing features of politics in the last 20 years, and in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, if people had played politics with race, religion, with colour in those years, the Great Migration could not have occurred. Wouldn't have happened. There would have been too much division. If somebody got up in the early 50s when Menzies signed the Refugee Convention, and if the Labour Party then said, this will mean the end of the White Australia policy, what would have happened? Would the Menzies government have fought for it? I don't know the answer. I would like to think they would have. But politicians knew that to raise these issues would incur extraordinary enmities that would last for a very long while. And Australia's had a long history of creating divisions within themselves. Again, that Prime Minister Billy Hughes in the First War, and most of you aren't old enough, and I'm not old enough to have any recollection of this, but it's well recorded. We had 5 divisions on the Western Front. The volunteerism was failing to keep pace with the commitment given to Britain to keep 5 frontline divisions in the trenches. The British had said, don't worry about logistics, support troops, we'll do all that boring stuff for you, just give us chaps for the trenches. That meant that our casualties for our numbers, and not only for our numbers in France, but for our numbers as a nation, were greater than anyone else's. And the Catholic bishop, newly arrived from Ireland, who did not oppose the war and had made this clear, was reported in a Melbourne suburban newspaper, not from the pulpit, saying that no, he opposed conscription because it would make an unequal contribution even more unequal. Billy Hughes decided, I will win the referendum, because he'd said he won't bring in conscription without a referendum. Had 2 referendums, he lost them both. But he said, I'll win if I turn it into an anti-Catholic, anti-Irish referendum. Now, many of you are old enough to remember or to recall or to have experienced some of the bitternesses between Catholics and Protestants in Australia, which did not start to die till the 1950s, the late 1950s. And so, if there hadn't been a settlement of the Irish question originally in 1922, it's my view that there would have been armed conflict in Australia as a consequence, and largely as a consequence of Billy Hughes and the way he played those referendum debates. And that just shows the total irresponsibility, the bitternesses, even hatreds that can occur, not just between people of different religion, but within a family, between families, when politicians irresponsibly use these issues for, well, if I use the word evil, someone will say that's too strong a word, and maybe it is, but for totally irresponsible and despicable purposes. And I regard the debate post-Tampa in relation to refugees on a par with Billy Hughes and the sectarian bitternesses and hatreds that he caused in Australia.
Thank you, Mr. Fraser, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. If I can now call upon South Australia's Lieutenant Governor, Mr. Hugh Van Lay, to give a vote of thanks.
Thousands of the former Vietnamese Boer people to share the stage with this great man, Malcolm Fraser. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, 34 years ago, in the wake of the end of the Vietnam War, my wife and 39 fellow boat people and I scrambled aboard leaky old fishing boats and embarked on the dangerous journeys across the waters of Southeast Asia in search of freedom and a safe place to live. And on arrival in Darwin, we were greeted with an Australian generosity of spirit that has proved to be deep and lasting. And while we were waiting on our boat for a decision from the government officials, if we were allowed to come ashore, I understand in federal government, in federal parliament, there were hot debates on our destiny. In the Senate, a minister was forced to reject claims by some organizations that some Vietnamese refugees were criminals and undesirable people. Federal cabinet was warned that the Indo-Chinese refugee problems, and I quote, threatens to precipitate a regional crisis of major dimensions, unquote. The same memorandum says that, and I quote, if the refugee problems were to get out of control, it would impose very, very serious strains on the unity and character of Australian society, unquote. And also it says that this new situation has all the ingredients for one of the most controversial and divisive issues in Australia's history, the document says. On national newspapers, headlines were full of sensations about Indo-Chinese refugees. There were questions about our characters, our religious belief, and motive of our arrival. In the public, there was unease in certain quarters and about our settlement, the values that we held, and livelihood of fitting into a new Australian society. In South Australia, Lower House, one MP raised the belief among farmers that our boats posed catastrophic disease threat to Australia's sheep and cattle population, unquote. Foot and mouth disease, anthrax and tuberculosis were all in danger of being introduced into Australia, apparently. In the midst of all this man and the government under his leadership decided to give us the chance to settle and to make a new life in this country. We, the Vietnamese, are extremely grateful that his government repeatedly made the case in favor of accepting refugees and took all the political flak. It found a way to absorb the criticism and respond to the knee-jerk reactions. And it had the courage to think long-term, to lift the collective vision of Australians in order to make ours ultimately a better and a richer society. We owe a debt of gratitude to Malcolm Fraser for demonstrating compassion, leadership, and foresight. Furthermore, as we all know, the Fraser government was also responsible in putting in place many policies and institutions to have turned some concepts of multiculturalism into reality and bringing practical benefits of cultural diversity to Australia. Much has happened, of course, since that time, and new chapters of continuing refugee story are being written virtually every day. So in recognition of this fact, I would like to end my comments by inviting to the stage a group of outstanding young South Australians. These young people are drawn from the various refugee communities in South Australia to come on the stage, and also David Lin, President of ARA. And they're here to present Mr. Fraser with a small gift, a symbol of our deep gratitude for his stand against bigotry and racism, and his strong conviction for human rights, humanity, fairness, and equality, and his love for Australia. Ladies and gentlemen, could I again ask that you all stand and express our appreciation to the Right Honourable Malcolm Fraser.
Thank you very much, Lieutenant Governor, and thank you all, ladies and gentlemen. I think it's...
Just show that to the people.
And the other is South Australian produce also, which we probably all know how to enjoy. So thank you very much for that, and I'd like to thank the children for coming. The two came from the Congo and from Vietnam. Where else? Vietnam and the Congo. Well, one of the things we're beginning to see, and we're going to see much, much more as the years pass, is people who come to Australia in recent years moving out into the community, getting to high places, as the Lieutenant Governor has, and contributing in many ways to improving the life of Australia, participating in public life, and doing so from, very often I think, from a sense of obligation to Australia. I met a young man, somebody yelled out, "Hi, Mal." I turned around, I didn't see anyone I knew, but there was a young man behind me in Collins Street in Melbourne in an Air Force uniform. He said, "Oh, I came here in the late 70s. I was a baby in my mother's arms, and as I grew up, the family wanted to repay Australia. So it was decided I should try and join the Air Force." So he was an airman. The Australian who've come here in recent times as refugees who with the Australian forces in Afghanistan. So more and more we are going to see Australians from many different origins contributing in wonderful ways to this country. Don't let those wretched people in Canberra muck it all up.
Ladies and gentlemen, what a wonderful evening, and as our evening draws to a close, I would like to quickly acknowledge the wonderful work that the Australian Refugee Association does. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with it. You will have noticed flyers on your seat describing the hope that ARA provides and the successful outcomes it achieves for both the new arrivals and those who have been in Australia for some time. We do offer you the chance to donate as you leave the hall in a few moments, so please give that your strongest consideration. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you and good evening.
Your comments about the Malaysia swap deal, you described it as odious. Could you just go into a bit more detail about that? What is fundamentally wrong with it?
Well, Malaysia is not a member of UNHCR. That's the first major thing that's wrong with it. People going there would be regarded as illegals, and if you looked at SBS programs over the last 2 or 3 nights, you see the sort of circumstances in which people who've been fleeing terror are already living in Malaysia. Well, the deal is only trying to be put in place to enable Australia to avoid obligations that Australia ought ethically to adopt and to accept. That's suppose my main reason against it.
And what could happen to children under this plan?
Well, we've been told that unaccompanied children can be sent there also. I mean, policy ought to be designed to try and keep families together, or to be designed to try and bring families together. At the moment, it's not.
Mr. Fraser, do you have any sense that there might be a renewed spirit of humanity, perhaps with a change in the Senate, or not?
I'd like to think so. We'll have to see how that plays out. I mean, the spirit of humanity is alive and abroad amongst Australians, but with the kind of leadership we've had ever since the Tampa incident, People have been taught to be fearful, people have been taught to be frightened, and too many people have believed what politicians have been saying. And so it's up to people, individuals, organisations. I think it's not you, but the SBS programs of the last 3 nights, where people who didn't like the idea of refugees too much, or asylum seekers, did a reverse journey back to the places where the refugees had come from. A novel idea, a very good idea, gave some insight into what people were flying from.